My name is Bob Macauley. I'm a pediatric palliative care doctor in Portland, Oregon, and my memoir is called Because I Knew You: How Some Remarkable Sick Kids Healed a Doctor's Soul, which was published earlier in June of this year and is the story of about 15 patients I've taken care of over the years and their families and the profound impact they have had on my life.
How long did it take you to write the book?
It took about 2 years to write, and then another year and a half to find a publisher, and then about another year and a half working through that process. But the writing process was a real gift in the sense that when I started thinking about writing this book, I was inspired by books by adult palliative care physicians, and they tell some beautiful stories that are also quite different than what we experience in pediatrics. And I wasn't familiar with any book out there that really talked about kids receiving palliative care. So when I thought about writing it, I reached out to the parents that I was still in touch with of kids who came to mind and ended up having these incredibly powerful conversations over Zoom. A lot of this was during pandemic where we remembered their child and the impact their child had on me and on others. And then I would write the chapter and then I'd send it back to them to say, read it, let me know what I got wrong. How can we make this better? And we'd have another conversation. So it was a wonderful opportunity for reconnection.
That's amazing. I was going to ask if they were involved at all.
The more you work in a hospital setting, including and maybe even especially a children's hospital, you lose sight of the fact of how unusual, at the very least, it is, and abnormal at worst it is, because kids aren't supposed to get sick. And children's hospitals are places where there are a lot of kids who are sick. And some of the places within the children's hospital are really other worlds. Like I think of the ICU and especially the neonatal ICU, where you have all these hulking machines and these tiny, tiny patients. And so I think one of the things that I try to do is paint a picture of that so people can really appreciate what that environment is like and how disorienting it is to parents because they should be home, cradling their baby in the nursery. They shouldn't be in a neonatal ICU. And it continues to amaze me, these parents who may not have any medical background whatsoever, their learning curve is so steep and they take it on so that the first day in the NICU, they look like a deer in the headlights. All these things, all these machines, all these weird words we're using. And then by a week or two in, it's incredible how much they've picked up and how they take part in rounds and they're so involved in their child's care. But that really is a steep learning curve.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate to that on both sides. I started working at Dornbecker in Portland. I went to school there. So is that where you work now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I feel like that hospital is like, we've been to so many all over the country. For my daughter, that one is like the most beautiful. It's the most beautiful setting. There's just like so much light in some parts of it. I remember when I was working there, so interesting because my daughter was 3 when I started working there. So I kind of was a parent and then started working with babies with swallowing disorders and a lot of children who were probably not going to have a long life expectancy. And just entering each exam room, it was like entering like a little cove, like a whole new world. You could really see like the family culture. And I think that you did that in your book. It's really interesting. It's each family and their belief systems and the way that they dress and the way that they address medical care is so specific. I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
One of the things that was interesting to me in the book was the way that you talk about different families' religion and your experience with religion. And I grew up in the deep South, so I'm very fascinated with religion because I was raised agnostic in like a place where there were like it was like a Pentecostal revival
Hmm.
happening around me.
Hmm.
So I have like this very curious way of being around individuals who are spiritual in any way because I'm just like, oh, how fun. So different. And I felt really invited in to this book, and that's something that's pretty rare for me. And I wondered if you wanted to
Mm.
speak to how you approach writing about that in a literary way.
Yeah, I think so. My background as an Episcopal priest, as well as a physician, so I think I am pretty well versed in theology. At the same time, it is interesting that depending on which metrics you look at, they have these surveys where they ask people throughout the country if they go to church or not. And when I say church, I don't mean just Christian church. It could be a synagogue, it could be temple, whatever it might be. And the two states that consistently rank the lowest in church attendance or religious service attendance are Vermont and Oregon. So I'm not sure what it says about me as an Episcopal priest that I spent my first 15 years of at least academic work in Vermont, and now I find myself halfway through that time here in Oregon. So I think I've gotten used to being with people who have very profound spiritual understanding or sensitivities, but may not identify as explicitly religious. And I'm also aware that my religious background can be off-putting to people sometimes. They may make assumptions about me by virtue of the fact that I am ordained in a specific denomination. And I think a lot of the things they may assume, I don't think actually are true, or at least I hope they're not. They may assume that I want them to convert to my way of thinking, which I don't think I do, or they may assume that I might judge them for taking actions that may fly in the face of certain religious doctrines, which I also try not to do. At the same time, I think that sometimes in places where religion is less commonly practiced, then spiritual care may also suffer. So we talk a lot about in palliative care taking care of the whole person or the whole family. So not just physical, but also emotional and social and spiritual. But sometimes I think spiritual like comes up the rear and gets lost in the mix sometimes. And I think that's a loss in the care that we provide. So when I ask people questions about their faith background, the way that I usually say it, this is not the right way, this is just my way of doing it, is to say something like a lot of people in tough situations find meaning or guidance in either religious or spiritual beliefs. Is that part of your life? And the goal of that is for them to feel free to say no, because maybe it's not, and that's okay, or to say it so broadly that they feel welcome in responding. Because if I say, "Do you go to church?" then I just sort of pigeonhole them, and I'm going to miss a lot of people who have very profound and important beliefs.
I love that. I think that's really, again, welcoming. And, in my very biased experience, because of where I grew up, rare,
Hmm.
I live in the Pacific Northwest too. I live in Seattle now, and I've really enjoyed the way that, in our experience, doctors will discuss spirituality and religion. I've actually found that to be like my favorite place to talk about, you know, what happens after, or what or ethics. Or as I was reading your book, I was like, oh, this is what I think. I wonder why I think this. It just kind of like made me aware that this is the only place that I've ever felt comfortable exploring those things. And I think that there's something really interesting about having a really clear grounding in science, and also being able to talk about, all the other things that you're talking about. There's a lot of discussion, of course, in your book about suffering and also what is just. And I was so pleased with that because I have a chip on my shoulder about the just world hypothesis. Because I raised a kid who had to have casts on her legs for most of her babyhood.
Yeah.
A lot of people would say, like, what happened to her? What did you do to her? Or like, what did you do during pregnancy? Like, so they could avoid that, as if, good things happen to good people if you make the right decisions. And I thought it was kind of funny how you wrote that doctors tend to be like very superstitious and believe bad things happen to good people.
Part of it is because we remember those things so much more.
Mhm.
Because it doesn't mean that if somebody engaged in behaviors and suffered health consequences, that that's not a sad thing. Like, if someone suffers from alcoholism and ends up having liver failure, that's a very sad thing. And I'm not saying it's not. The ones that really stick in our craw, though, are the ones where somebody did nothing whatsoever. A baby did nothing to deserve what they got in terms of an illness. And most of the time, their parents did nothing either. And so, in that situation, it sticks with us because it seems so incredibly unjust. And trying to come to grips with that. And the fact that I'm still talking about this, I think is actually kind of noteworthy. Like I've been practicing pediatric palliative care, which is sort of a specialty that focuses on injustice for 20 years. And now I'm still kind of trying to figure out a way to make sense of all this as opposed to have letting go of that whole hope for justice that I've had for my whole life. I probably will never get rid of it, but I think I'm at least recognizing that maybe it's time to let go of it a little bit more.
Do you feel like other doctors who work with you or who you've worked with who have the same role have a similar way of sort of approaching these, what I think most people would describe as kind of impossible situations?
I think that there's a general consistency of coming to acceptance of all the things that we are powerless to change. I think that if somebody wants to go out and fix stuff and cure people, they probably wouldn't find their way to my specialty. And if they did, they wouldn't stay there very long because it's not going to fulfill their hopes. So I think that there's that general sense. The other thing that I would say is flipping it a little bit from the provider's standpoint to the family standpoint. I have a pretty busy life. I have 4 kids. This is a busy week. We got 1 kid graduating from high school, another one from middle school. I think my life is busy. Then I come into work and I talk to families of the patients I treat, and I'm just walking down the yellow brick road, in terms of complexity compared to what these folks are dealing with. And the thing about it is the vast majority of them don't seem to at least convey the impression that it's a big deal. Like, certainly there are moments where they're, like, drowning and overwhelmed, and I get that. But most of the time, they're like, "Yeah, I did these 18 different things for my kid in the last, like, 3 hours. I'm just going along. This is what I do. This is my life." And every time I observe to them, like, "Wow, it's incredible what you do," they usually brush it off to be like, "What else am I gonna do? This is my kid. I love my kid." But it still deserves to be identified and named and honored, the fact that they do so much for their kids in such a self-sacrificing and generous way.
There was some discussion about different ways of coming to acceptance, denial to acceptance. And one of them that you wrote about was being transactional, and
Mhm.
also just the different ways that medical practitioners will perceive parents when they experience that
Yeah.
initial denial. And I wondered if you wanted to speak about that. It seemed to come up here and there quite often.
Transactional piece maybe goes back to what we were saying earlier about this hope for a just world. And so a transactional piece is like, if I do this, then the universe or God or whatever will have to do that for me. And I think that that's challenging from a spiritual standpoint because, as we just talked about, that probably isn't true or doesn't seem to be true given available evidence. And the risk of it is that people, to use the old cliche, put all their eggs in one basket. And I mentioned briefly one parent who didn't just believe that God could heal her child, but that God had specifically promised to heal her child, which ended up being pretty much an all or nothing scenario. So either her child is healed and her faith survives and maybe is even stronger by virtue of that confirmation, or her child is not healed and she leaves the hospital without her child and without her faith, which is actually what happened. So trying to help people understand out of their whatever faith tradition they may be functioning from or whatever their belief system is, that that doesn't always hold true. That there's clear evidence out there that good people have bad things happen to them that they did not deserve. Um, and while I don't feel like it's my place to tell people what to believe spiritually, I do feel like I have enough theological training that if someone is within my tradition, we can actually dialogue about that. And the interesting piece about it is I find a lot of people within the Christian tradition who say, well, if I do this, then God will do that. And I was like, well, actually, the only time Jesus ever got asked about this, he said exactly the opposite. People came to him and said, who's responsible for this child's illness? And he said, nobody's responsible. What are you talking about? So trying to free them up from that and maybe disentangle faith from outcome hopefully will allow them to, regardless of what the outcome is, to have a sense of community and faith that will remain intact.
That's really beautiful. It reminds me of one of the lines that sorrow is a part of faith. in one
Mhm.
of the families, and I thought that's something that I can relate to. I because of the way that I was raised, my father was very much into ethics. That was his like degree was in ethics or
Mhm.
something like that. And so he had taught us to believe in the possibility of awe, but to always accept what's happening.
Yeah.
And sorrow is something that I've like learned to talk about more because I think that it's different than sadness. It's just sort of this much deeper, I think, experience of loss and grief and all the things happening at the same time.
Palliative care 101 is always have tissues with you when you have conversations because we have a lot of those tough conversations to the point where I'm sort of known around the hospital because I carry a camp chair, a tripod camp chair with me wherever I go, which serves two purposes. One is I'm a tall person, so it helps me to not loom over people, which never makes anybody feel good. And the second thing, it's got a little pocket, and I always carry tissues and business cards because those are the things I always forget. So that's palliative care 101. Palliative care 301, if you will, is you brought the tissues, don't always bring them out. Because if someone starts crying just a tiny little bit and you're like, here, and you put tissues before them, it can be interpreted as, I'm really uncomfortable with this crying thing that you're doing. Can you please stop? Which is not what we wanna say. Like, if someone is, like, blubbering, and they got snot coming out and all this kinda stuff, then give them the tissues just to be a nice person. But our goal here is not to take sadness away or to make it stop. I think our goal is to enter into it with them so that they don't feel alone.
And it's in your book, just like kind of the toll that that takes
Mhm.
on you as a person. Do you have any thoughts like beyond what's in the book about how you've learned to cope with your job?
Yeah. I think people do it in different ways, and I think that we are doing better as a profession recognizing the toll that that takes. So when I was at my previous job in Vermont, if I wasn't on vacation, I was on call. So that was not a super sustainable plan over a long period of time. So I think that it's important to have time when you are explicitly not on call or not responsible. The other thing is trying to figure out who your resources are in what areas. So I have a wonderful spouse who signed up to marry me, but didn't necessarily sign up to hear every story of every patient that I treat, I don't think. So it doesn't mean that she's not supportive or that I can't talk about life, but I'm not going to go home and debrief every single sad case with her. That's not super healthy, I don't think. Um, and I think that there is a great benefit from having people who you don't have a perfectly reciprocal relationship with. Um, and what I mean by that mostly is a therapist or a guide of some sort. Because if things have to be reciprocal, then if I dump a whole lot of super heavy stuff on somebody else, then they're just going to dump their super heavy stuff. And then I'm not sure if I'm feeling any lighter. I just might have gotten more burdens along the way. So I think that people need to have resources where they feel like they're not always looking out for the other person and they can entirely look out for themselves for a little while. I think that can be really healthy.
What do you hope that people take away from your book?
Well, I hope that they recognize what families and kids go through because I think that it's nice to think about kids always being healthy. And a lot of people probably haven't come across childhood illness. And if so, that's great. That is awesome. At the same time, that is part of a lot of people's lives. And I think it's worth recognizing and honoring. And in addition to that, that it's not all sad. Like there's a lot of sadness. But this, as you said before, this is not a book of unrelenting sadness. This is a book of sadness and meaning and celebration and hope. And my wish for people reading it is that they learn about this world that some families experience and that they learn that it's not what they would assume that world is, that there's a lot more to it than that, that can be truly inspiring and truly healing. I mentioned this in the book. I don't tell people anymore really what I do for a living. When they say, "What do you do?" I say, "I'm a pediatrician." Technically true. And then they're like, "Oh, that's great." And they have this image of, well babies and immunizations and things like that. Um, and then only if they really push do I start narrowing down because I'm like, if you really want to know, I'll tell you. But you asked me an innocent question that you were not prepared for this answer that I was going to give you, so you don't want to hear that. But it allows for some interesting things. My son and I go on dive trips, and we were at the end of a dive trip. So we've been on this boat for a week with these 20 other people. And one of them came up to me and she's like, "So you said you were a pediatrician." So we hadn't really talked much over the course of the week. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, so you deliver babies?" I'm like, "No, no, that's the obstetrician. I take care of the babies once they're born." And she said, "Oh, well, that's a relief." And I looked at her quizzically. I'm like, what do you mean that that's a relief?" She's like, "Well, if you delivered the babies, then you'd get very emotionally attached to them. So I guess you don't have to worry about that." And I was nodded. I'm like, "Oh, that would be terrible if I got emotionally attached." So we kind of let that conversation go by the wayside.
My last question is about the publishing process. And I wonder, like, did you have an agent? How I think you said it took a little while to get your book to a publisher. So I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so I did it backwards. I think that smarter people than me, if you're working on, especially in the nonfiction arena, would find a publisher first, and then be able to tailor the book to what the publisher was hoping for. I did it exactly the opposite. Not by intention. I think I just didn't understand the nonfiction world very well. And also, I wasn't actually sure I could write this book. So I came up with the idea, but then I'm like, this is going to be not just hours, I mean, just heart. There's a lot of heart that would go into this. And so I got it done. And then I started looking, I did the traditional routes to try to find an agent. I also did submitted it to a bunch of publishers who accept unagented submissions, and I had about a half dozen agents who were curious about it. And when they looked at it, either in partials or full manuscript, had very nice things to say and had the same conclusion, which is, I can't sell this book. Like, it's about kids who mostly don't survive, which I knew, and I knew it would be a hard sell. Um, and I just got really, really lucky. Part of it was I knew I wasn't going to give up. One of the parents that I mentioned in the book, when I told all the parents that I worked with, at any point along the way, right up until it comes out, if it ever does, you can always say don't, and I'll take that chapter out because first rule of medicine is do no harm. And she paused and said something I will never forget. She said, "Look, the worst thing that could ever happen to me happened to me. My kid died. The second worst thing that could happen is if the world forgot him." So as soon as she said that, I'm like, I'm a stubborn person. I wasn't going to give up easily, but now I can't give up. Like, this can't not be out there. So I explored and got a lot of information on self-publishing options, which there's some beautiful books out there that are self-published. And I just got really lucky. I was having coffee with an old friend of mine who's a poet. We graduated from the same MFA program. Told her about the book, and then she asked to read it, and she was positively struck by it. And I was bemoaning the challenges of finding a publisher, and she said, my publisher has focused mostly on poetry, but they're starting a new imprint that is looking at other areas. Would you mind if I introduced you? And like, as far as questions go, they don't come any easier than that for me to answer. And I said yes. And Chehalem Press and Eric Muir is the publisher. Um, Took it on and has been wonderful. Um, Although it's kind of funny speaking to especially MFA folks out there who probably have experienced a lot of rejection, of which I've experienced a lot of rejection. When I sent him the manuscript, he wrote me back a couple weeks later an email, and he said, "Hey, dear Bob, he said nice things. Like, this is a beautiful book. I really moved by it, but," and then there was a but, and then he said, "But I would really love to publish this for you," or something like that. And I was like, what the heck's up with the but? Because everyone who's ever gotten a rejection letter, you're just waiting for the but, right? Like, all the nice stuff, you're just like, okay, come on, come on, come on. And then I was all ready for it, but I just can't work it or it doesn't fit. And then for some reason, it didn't change direction. So at some point, I don't think I ever told him that story. I'll be like, dude, you got to watch out for your conjunctions because that was an and. That was an and moment that you put a but in there, and my heart thudded for a quick second.